What do Americans generally and farmers especially make of President Trump's proposed tariffs? And how are voters feeling about the economy? Well, let's find out. Welcome to another Battleground Briefing. I'm CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, joined by Anthony Salvanto, CBS News Director of Elections and Polling. As we convene this morning, the president has helpfully provided us with some polling fodder, claiming in a tweet this morning, I think we have it, that he said, wow, highest poll numbers in the history of the Republican Party. That includes Honest Abe Lincoln and Ronald Reagan. There must be something wrong. Please recheck that poll. We're going to presume that's sarcasm there. We're told he's referring to, some White House officials at least think he's referring to a recent Wall Street Journal survey. They didn't do polling back when Abraham Lincoln was president, right?
Oh, the response rate by telegraph was awful. No, it's a joke. No, we didn't have scientific polling back in Lincoln, but there is anecdotal evidence that some folks walked around and sort of kept count in their wards of which people felt which way.
Really?
But it's not scientific polling. No, the CBS News poll does go back to Reagan, though, and a little bit earlier than that even. And look, what he's referring to there is his support among Republicans, and that is exceptionally high. That is very high. I mean, we've seen it approaching the 90% level, certainly in the 80s. And, you know, part of that, obviously, it speaks to the president is popular with Republicans, of course, but it also speaks to the era that we're in, which is exceptionally partisan. And a lot of times we see, even when partisans of either side happen to disagree with their president on one particular policy or another, they still move towards overall support. And part of it really just tells you about who's in the parties right now. We can't imagine that the composition of the parties is the same across all years, because it isn't. Right. Republicans have overall become more conservative, and people who identify as Democrats overall have become somewhat more liberal. So it's a little bit apples and oranges to go historically, and that's I'll end the sort of wonk out on the poll numbers there, but that's where it is.
And our latest poll is a national survey of Americans all across the country. Where does the president's level of support sit right now? Well,
support is as it has been. I mean, one of the things that's been remarkable through this Battleground Tracker and also in his approval numbers is that it hasn't moved much at all. He's in the mid-40s, the low 40s, and the number of people who say that they are Trump supporters, period, has remained very steady throughout his entire term. We've seen a little bit of a move over the course of the term from people who said they were willing to consider him, not yet ready to support, but would give him a chance early on, and they've moved into a category that we've called resistors. They are the strongest opponents. So it's been polarizing in that way within the folks who could have moved to his side, but have chosen over time not to.
And you ask about support. We were talking about this earlier. There's actually a huge difference in polling between approval, favorability, and support. So why do we ask about support, and what's the difference between those three?
What we tried to get here is what it means to you. So do you, the person at home, support or oppose what a president is doing? Approval on job is his performance in the job, in the office. But what we've ended up seeing is that the two correlate really strongly. Favorability is different, and that's actually a really important point here, because favorability often goes to personal characteristics. There have been presidents that have had low favorability and high job approval, and vice versa. It's important here in this context. One of the things we see is that when folks tell us now that they're disappointed in how the president has behaved personally and by his behavior, even if they give him credit on the economy, they're much more reluctant to approve of him overall. And one of the things we've seen in this president's numbers is that views of him personally have actually had a larger effect on his overall numbers. And one of the reasons that even with a good economy, with what most people say is a good economy, he still doesn't have over 50% overall approval, is that personal ratings sort of weigh things down.
Big focus of this week's poll was on the tariffs decision. Where do Americans come down on it generally?
Yeah, short-term negative. Short-term, there's a majority that says that it could cause pain for the U.S. economy. The big thing that struck me out of it is even when you talk to people who are, say they are directly impacted, or they're in farming, or they're in agriculture in particular, they look like the rest of the country in that they break along partisan lines. So you see them say, you know, they're willing to take some short-term pain, or they think there will be some short-term pain anyway, but they still support the president on trade. And if you look at their long-term outlook, they think it could lead to better trade deals down the road. if they're Republicans and if they voted for him, but everybody else does not. So here again, what you see is, look, trade is a complicated policy, right? It's economists have a hard time wrestling with it. I do, and a lot of people do. So what do you do at home? You follow the person that you voted for. But what I think is interesting is, I mean, you've been, as you cover Congress, you've seen, and we just saw on the show, some congressional members coming out and saying, wait a second, we Republicans were for free trade. We don't hand out, $12 billion to farmers, and they're pushing back against that.
That's right. If you look at this past week, two members of the president's party had critical statements on this. I think it was instructive. Let's take a look. Ben Sasse and Bob Corker. Take a look at this.
Trade wars are stupid. We want more trade in the world, and right now we're drifting into this trade war in ways that are going to have lots of negative consequences for American consumers and for American producers.
What about the president saying tariffs are great this morning?
Yeah, I happen to disagree. I think we, moving to a zero tariff world, and I think it's unfortunate that, if you look at the tariff levels between us and the European Union, they're roughly equivalent, and where we ought to go is to a zero tariff world, and what would have been a better approach would be to have pursued TTIP, the transatlantic trade agreement, where we could have dealt with all of these issues, and plus the regulatory barriers.
And you see two other Republican senators walk by as he gets those questions, Bob Corker there. Glad to not be asked it. Why that's instructive, I think, is because, Sasse is somebody who gets talked about as a potential future presidential contender, maybe even someone that would challenge the president, and comes from one of those big farming states that is going to be potentially adversely affected by these decisions. And Corker, of course, is one of his leading critics on just about everything. And it just shows you that it's running the spectrum of the party right now, the big concern about this. Ron Johnson's comments today to Margaret were a little more tepid than they were earlier, or last week. He suggested this was Soviet style. He wouldn't go that far this week. I think that speaks to the fact that he's home. And he probably heard from Trump supporters who said, hey, give him a chance. Let him figure this out. And yet he comes from one of those big farming states where this could become a huge problem. So the challenges are evident for especially Republicans as this plays out in the next few weeks.
Yeah, and I think it plays out is the key word there, right? I mean, in the short term, you can say, well, give it a chance. Well, give it a chance. And in that case, right, to a very large degree, the Republicans are behind the president in almost everything he does.
Right.
But what if this doesn't pay off down the road, right? That's what they're worried about, especially, you've got people, Corker's not running.
Right. Well, and we saw it, too, in a conversation we had with voters last week in Miami, far away from farming country, place that wouldn't necessarily be affected by this. But we put it to them. We said, what about this tariffs decision? What do you make of it? These answers, I think, are also instructive. What's your understanding of the trade war that he's overseeing or seeking with Europe, with China? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
More tariffs might be a bad thing. It's early to tell, too early, because they're just going to put sanctions, more tariffs on us, and it's just. But I think in the long run, he wants to bring home jobs, so it could be a good thing, but it's too soon.
The trade war is definitely a good thing. Trump campaigned on it. This country has been ripped off for the last 30, 40 years by other countries. And it's not fair. Trump wants fair trade, and I agree with him 100%. And I think that eventually we are going to win the trade war.
What is that going to look like, though?
It's going to be some pain in this process right now.
For who?
For China, for Canada, for Mexico, for the EU, even for maybe some industries in the United States. But it's going to be worth it for the long term because they're going to flinch eventually. The other countries, China and Canada, they're going to come and they're going to call Trump and they're going to want to make a deal. And we are going to win this trade war.
I think the word tariffs scare a lot of people, but I think it's too early to tell. I see China as being eating us alive for years and years. And no president, again, the same term, had the testicular fortitude to do anything. This man is doing what he has to do.
I think it may hurt us, and I in that sense, I don't see him to be such a great negotiator. He placed tariffs on other countries. He wasn't banking on other countries turning around and doing the same to us. So we'll see how that plays out in the future.
Trump is a master negotiator. He knows what he's doing.
Exactly.
He is a genius.
In case you couldn't tell, the two guys there are obviously big supporters of the president. And the first woman who spoke, Yanina, essentially a right-leaning independent who would, I think, like to support the president, but feels that in a lot of ways his behavior and what he says can be really damaging. So she falls into that category of sort of on the fence. And Monica, who spoke last there, the only true Democrat at the table, couldn't bring herself to suggest at all that anything he's doing could potentially be good for the country. It just shows you how deep-rooted these feelings are about him. But striking that all of them said pretty much too soon to tell, and cautiously optimistic or pessimistic about what could transpire.
And the other thing that strikes me out of that is that, the table you assembled is probably one of the few tables at which people sit around talking about trade policy,
right,
the abstract, if they're not directly affected by it, which is why so much of this, even in the polling, people tell us, comes back to principle. And that's why, in fact, the numbers may not move a lot in the short term. We had a third of people in the poll say, even if they didn't like, in particular, what he was doing on trade policy now, they were glad that he was trying. And we asked if this was a matter of principle or a pocketbook. And there were a lot of people who said, it's just what the U.S. should be doing. And so that's how sometimes these policies, often are viewed until they actually get some kind of payoff.
The overwhelming number of respondents to this are not in agriculture.
Right.
How hard is it to actually find people who are when you're trying to do this kind of a survey?
Very. In fact, what we had to do for this one was get an even larger sample than we normally do because it's less than 10%. It was 8% or so that said that they were in that particular business. So what we did there was just get enough so that we could analyze that particular subsection. Anytime you do a poll, what you're trying to create is a microcosm of the country. But if a slice of that is really small, then you've got to do an even larger poll. So that's what we did. And what's also interesting too is you raised this point earlier in this show that a lot of this isn't necessarily, we're not arguing over things that affect people right at home. And I thought that was a really good point because it's certainly borne out by the polling. It's very often revolving around what you think of the president. Yeah. And I see this really high correlation between how you think things are going, and if you think things are going really well or really badly, you're more motivated to vote. If you support the president really strongly or really in opposition, you're more motivated to vote, and everybody else is kind of in between.
Well, it's when we're fighting over tariffs that are going to affect farmers, separating families who've just come across the border. I mean, these are not things that happen to most everyday Americans and have no direct effect on them, really. And so ultimately, they're kind of proxy fights about what do you think of the president, what do you think of Congress? And if that's all this is breaking down to, these campaigns across the country for the House and the Senate, you just wonder, when or how will they break down? And at what point can we really say it's going this way or it's going that way? Yeah. Suggest that this is going to break late, or suggest that still some unforeseen circumstance or event could still have a big effect on things.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you think the Democrats sort of want it to be just about Trump? I mean, in that sense, you just look at, say, a 42%, you think, oh, we must have an advantage. Because I'm not sure the polling says that they would win in that scenario.
No, I think in the back of their mind, some of them wish it was just about him. Because then they don't have to get into specifics, which then leads to these huge ideological skirmishes within the party about how far do we go on health care, how far do we go on immigration, and all these other issues. But even talking to Selena Zito, who was also on the show, she said in her travels, and I would agree with this, based on the little I've seen so far, it's going to come down to local issues or local issues of personality. Who is the person running? Do I see them as an effective check on the president, or assistant to the president, or somebody who is going to tell it like it is when it makes sense? And I think in all these different places, that's going to factor out in different ways. It's why some Democrats are so bullish on guys like Joe Manchin and Heidi Heitkamp and Claire McCaskill holding on, because their home state brand, despite being a Democrat, is so strong. And then there's concerns about others whose brand is not as strong. And I think we'll see that with these House races as well. If you find these compelling characters, that may just be enough in a year where there isn't necessarily something that directly affects things. Another issue, of course, that will play out and be a big factor here is the economy. And once again, you find most people are somewhat okay with what's going on.
Yeah, so you've got optimism outweighing pessimism as people look ahead, right? We know that for a long time that people have said that the economy is good, but what I want to watch as the campaign unfolds is how much of a message is that from Republicans and from the president, right? I mean, as you said earlier, he's sort of talking about these other issues. He's talking about immigration. Well, there's a much more clear divide on that. Does that motivate the base? Okay, it probably does. But you would normally expect a campaign in a time when people think things are good, think the economy is good, to be running on that, right? Okay, keep status quo. Things are okay. The economy's okay. It's always a top issue. So I think that's one of the things to watch is how much of the messaging says, okay, the economy's good. And you see, even though Democrats are sort of much more reluctant to give the president credit for it, there is a percentage of them. There is a fifth, maybe even a third that will go ahead and say, things are okay, and give him, at least some partial credit. And that's part of the, if this whole thing is decided on the margins, that could be one group. Democrats are okay enough to maybe keep sending a Republican to Congress.
Yeah. We'd be remiss if we didn't ask about Russia. I know you did. U.S. specifically, what people make of the idea that this is a witch hunt.
Yeah.
And
Republicans think it is, right? So 7 in 10 Republicans say, yes, it's a politically motivated witch hunt. Democrats, as soon as they hear it, they say, no, this is a critical matter of national security. One of the things also interesting is how many, especially the president's strongest supporters, when asked, what happens when you hear criticism of the president?
Yeah.
Does it make you reevaluate anything? Do you take it? They say, no, that it makes them want to rush to the president's defense. And it's part of this larger view that they have that he is under more pressure from, quote unquote, the establishment than other presidents in the past. So, look, and the other thing is we've got people getting different news feeds, people getting different streams of information too. So we also see Republicans saying that they're more skeptical about the FBI, about U.S. intelligence agencies, all of which show that some of the White House's messaging on this, at least to the base, is resonating, and it's not, people aren't sort of updating information.
We found that 11% of Trump supporters get their news from mainstream news sources.
I think it's accurate. Yeah, I think it's accurate.
Or think that that mainstream media is accurate.
Is accurate. Yeah, I mean, the bulk of them say that they believe the president is accurate and that they believe their friends and family are a good source of information. So this is something we've been watching for a long time as people sort of circles close around them. It's not everybody, I should emphasize that, but for the most dedicated partisans, it often is. They're surrounding themselves by people who are like-minded, and they're also listening to sources who are like-minded. And so that's partly why none of these numbers move. It is different, though, I should emphasize, in principle, when people look ahead to 2018 and we ask, well, what happens if the Russians interfere? And nobody thinks that's okay.
Right, yeah. Anthony Salvanto is our Director of Elections and Polling. The new book's coming out soon, right?
It is, August 21st.
What's the name of it again?
Where did you get this number? A pollster's guide to making sense of the world. Look, it's a book for everybody about how we do all this and what it all means.
It's important stuff, especially this time of year, at this time of a political cycle. I'm Ed O'Keefe, CBS News in Washington. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.